Okay, good morning, everyone. So, as we had discussed, this is a recording for the Thursday's lecture in continuance to what we were doing, discussing about the Indian economy in the last class. The purpose of having this recorded is for you to all have a look at this lecture recording at your own convenience and make sure that there are a couple of things that are mentioned in it in terms of specific readings and the nature of those conversations before you come in for Tuesday's class, which is the coming Tuesday's class. I would also assign a specific time slot next Thursday for sharing feedback on your chapter review assignment that has come through and been submitted yesterday. Um, so feedback on the chapter review assignment will be done to make sure that for those of you, especially those who are writing a book review for the first time, have critical insights on what areas they can sort of work on for the end term review, book review submission. And even otherwise, for any queries on the assignment at large or the book you're reviewing, we could discuss those then. This will be done during class hours on Thursday in the next week, which the date of which is going to be the 24th of July. So I'll send a separate email in this effect, which is going to be available through the announcement note. Um, so we'll have that time reserved for your reference. So I just wanted to sort of mention these two important points before I begin. So as we were discussing in the last class, a lot of our conversation was positioned on the British colonial administration, the period of time between 1800 to 1850, and then 1850 onwards to the 1900s. The nature of the colonial administration, the period of time of the Raj, and how uh, the rule of the British Empire was designed under the constitutive elements of an imperial umbrella, which were in areas of law, language, and knowledge, as the author talks about. The period of time between 1920 and 1950 is particularly interesting within the Indian economic and political history. One of the reasons for this is because the peak of India's nationalism movement or the independence movement is shaped around these years. It is also the period of time when Britain, as a global uh, hegemonic actor, around that period of time loses its significant um, appeal as an empire nation state. Um, the First World War and the Second World War and the interwar years uh, sort of wreck its economy and its sort of larger position in the global standing. It's more in the international uh, relations or geopolitical scenario. It's the United States which sort of becomes a more assertive leader during these years. So that displacement at the level, or the disruption at that level, um, happening around those years has its effect on the colonies as well. By the colonies of the British Empire, I mean, India was in this particular period also experiencing a series of economic shocks, starting from what it saw in the First World War, given that its own sort of exchange rate was managed closely with the value of the British pound or sterling. It operated, a lot of its trade currency was impacted. The Indian businesses and merchants got a lot more space to do business within the country. It's a point I had mentioned in the last class. Given there was a lot of capital investment slowdown from the European counterparts, and those things are integral and important for from that reference to know that it is this Indian business climate that allows then over a period of time for a certain degree of change to take place uh, in financing or supporting the independence movement, the Indian scenario. So there's some critical timelines to keep in mind. Of course, we have on the left hand side, we've discussed those more so in our conversation the last class. I want to position some of our time in discussing the post-colonial India narrative at large, which is for the years of time immediately after independence, and then you have stages or phases in which different political leaders have different political economic outlooks. The nature of industrial policy changes. A lot of the economic performance outlook for the Indian economy changes over those years, and it's important to understand who are the chief agents or anchors or actors, politically speaking, who are responsible behind bringing those changes at large, at least at the national level. You have the period of time between 1947 to 64 when Jawaharlal Nehru, who's the first prime minister and also one of the main voices of India's freedom and independence movement, is the prime minister of India. It's it's a it's a it's it's a period of time which sees a drastic shift from sort of a colonial rule to a post-colonial independent nation state. India's average rate of growth around this period is around 4%, which may not seem a lot at the time, but its average rate of growth up until 1947, in the first half of the 20th century, was 1%. So an average rate of growth of 1% moving up to 4% is a significant shift in those times. Nehru's economic planning model was inspired a lot by the Fabian socialist agenda of the Soviet Union. He was very impressed with the Soviet Union's ability to get big industrial capital, state planning, machinery to anchor investment or public investment in infrastructure in many of those areas, and then build that in order to attract and generate private capital and private investment. At the same time, I think the limitations of a Soviet based planning model was that it gave state a lot more of the assertive presence in the nature of both design, formation, and execution of industrial policy. And that scenario changes or moves later on as well. India, for the period of time between again 1947 to 64, also experiences military wars with Pakistan and a war with China. But it's been the only war which India uh, lost and saw many effects of that war sort of only resurfacing the last few years of its sort of border and military conflict with China surfacing. This is around 1920, oh, sorry, 2020, 2021. But these wars with Pakistan and China around that time were critical in identifying the nature of challenges India would go on to face in its regional border road nature or regions going ahead. And that's been a critical point for any emerging world power or emerging developing country to face or experience. If it faces a major regional conflict which perpetuates its itself after every few decades or after every few years, the ability of that country to branch out from its strategic independent goals uh, is in some cases limited. And so what happens, as you see with the Indian context, is it often continues to face a certain degree of challenge from its neighbor in the west, northwest, Pakistan, or in that sense, China. And those two countries and the conflict with those countries keep affecting Indian national security agenda in years to come. In the pre sort of 1947 or the colonial period, the geographical space of India was, as I had shown you in the map, inclusive of areas than earlier, than later partition Pakistan, East Pakistan, later becoming Bangladesh. So the geographical nature of the conflict and the proximate nature of what would consider as adversaries who are present in the region does not allow for regional economic or political integration to take place at the level at which it could have been imagined. The period of time between 1964 to 1980 becomes then more important from the perspective of the Nehru sort of years. As Nehru passes, uh, his daughter Indira Gandhi comes to power in the at the national level. Um, there is very little, um, evidence of Indira Gandhi naturally asserting her presence to become India's prime minister or play a larger role in national politics. In fact, there is a huge internal divide in the Congress party, the party which Nehru was also the main president at the time of his prime ministership. Once he passes away, there is a overwhelming consensus on whether the party should move on from the Nehru family to appoint anyone else as its president, and there should be an internal democratization process for the party leader to be elected. And what the Congress party experiences is an internal divide on who should basically lead the party forward. There is one wing which is a sort of a family loyalist, a group of congressmen who feel that Indira Gandhi, as Nehru's daughter, should come and sort of assert a more dominant position in the party and the national leadership, while you have the other wing of leaders who feel that it's time to move on, and there are other leaders who can come in. And this the rise of the Indian National Congress Syndicate, which is a sort of a rebel group against the Nehru family loyalists, take a position that maybe it's time for the party leadership and the national leadership to move outside the Nehru family space for looking at the next leader. So there is a lot of internal churn. I mean, the period of time between 1964 to roughly what you would see is 66, 67, there is a lot of internal uh, confusion amongst the Congress party, which at that time was the dominant party. The syndicate actually gives way to the imagination of an alternative political reference in the Indian um, political class. It is members of those syndicate who opt out to get out of the Congress party, think about a new coalition or a new party to counter the rise of the Indian Congress after they realize that uh, Indira Gandhi has been chosen to be part of the national leadership of the party. She becomes then India's prime minister. And Indira Gandhi, as the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, attempts to continue some of his policies on the economic ideological spectrum as well, but takes a position which is more hardened on the left of the political and economic agenda. It is in reference to the economic policy framework and industrial policy landscape, a period of time when India would have otherwise wanted to branch out to become relatively more independent. Um, you would have experienced or seen that the Indian economy actually shut itself off from further, in fact, during these years against capital investment or foreign investment coming into the country. And that is where I think the real prospects of growth were affected or impacted in a negative way. You had countries like South Korea and much so in the East Asian region becoming more export oriented in terms of their industrial policy, in terms of their economic growth model, which allowed them to sort of become or have sectors which would become eventually more competitive and globally positioned to take these countries forward. South Korea too had a very similar position to India up until 1964. In fact, India marginally was performing better than South Korea on some of the macroeconomic indicators. But the nature of policy shift and the kind of leadership India saw politically under Indira Gandhi during these 15, 16 years, that is between 1964 to 1980, and then 1980 to 1984, those 3 terms of Indira Gandhi's rule or being in power as India's prime minister became identified with a protectionist, close-ended, extremely left of the political and economic agenda, a set of policies that would otherwise and over time inhibit India's economic growth potential. It was also the same period of time where 2 or 3 critical events shaped India's political landscape. One was the invocation of a constitutional emergency, where the functioning or the operative or the functional base of India's constitutional functioning was suspended. All rights of citizens were suspended by the Indira Gandhi administration, and this was present for a period of 2 years in the mid 1960s, 1960 5, 1967, 68. That period of time was extremely tumultuous, and the emergency years were identified with a capture of anyone opposing the party in command or any of its directives, and a lot of the opposition leaders were jailed in this period of time. It's something which has not been seen I'm sorry, I think I got the years wrong. It's 1975, not 65. 64, 65 is when Indira Gandhi comes to power. But 1975, Indira Gandhi's government it declares internal emergency. I mean, the reasons they cited for doing so was of national security or internal disturbances. But the declaration, I mean, under Article 352 of the Indian Constitution, what it did was it suspended fundamental rights and extensively limited civil liberties. And this was, for a lot of people who don't know much about it, it was an action which the Indira Gandhi government took in response to a court ruling, which is a court ruling against Indira Gandhi in engaging in a certain level of election malpractice. It was done in order to, I mean, the emergency was declared in order to sort of respond to that court case which had disqualified Indira Gandhi and declared her sort of electoral victory null and void. The emergency led to what would you would see as the most widespread protests and opposition led response at the national level. It was There were civil society activists, opposition leaders who all sort of got together to be able to resist this. And there was um, a larger presence of national leaders who emerged, in fact, around these protest movements. But what it did between this period of those 1975 to 77, the 2 3 years when the emergency was in effect, is that it significantly affected India's positioning as a important critical geopolitical player who would have anything significant to offer to the world at large, given the nature of its own internal conflicts being seen at the time. And what the emergency also signified was the first instance in the post independent India, which adopted a fairly liberal constitution, giving extensive rights to individuals and citizens on many issues of civic and political freedoms. So, this was the first instance that led to the period of censorship, political repression, and a significant strengthening of the executive branch's power vis-a-vis the judiciary and the legislative. So, the separation of powers between those three wings was affected. Of course, after a period of time, the emergency was revoked. Indira Gandhi lost the election. You had new prime minister briefly. And then, in another instance of a third term, Indira Gandhi came back in power and was the prime minister until she was assassinated in 1984. Um, and the assassination uh, happened as a result of a major conflict with um, the Sikh community in India, and the response of the Indira Gandhi administration to it. And it was one of her bodyguards who had killed her. It led to a huge sympathy wave for her son, then later on, Rajiv Gandhi, to be brought into power. The period of time between 1984 to 1988, or just generally the decades of the 1980s, was much more uh, progressive in context to the nature of economic policy agenda shift that the economy saw, in reference to the Rajiv Gandhi years, who took power after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. There was a shift which was more pro-business in the economic policy helm. A lot of the bureaucratic regulations, licenses that were put in place under previous Indira Gandhi administrations were relaxed or reduced to encourage technological imports. I mean, the 80s is a period of time where most countries in parts of East Asia are booming. It started giving India a sort of um, an example of how many countries with similar economic challenges and political structures were still doing much better, while India was sort of losing out from being more openly engaged with the rest of the world. So the Rajiv Gandhi years, in the 4 or 5 years he was in power, saw a greater progressive shift in the um, period of time, for which was progressive in terms of both economic ideology, but also in the nature of administrative functioning within the government. Uh, there is a very fascinating reading by Atul Kohli, which I will mention towards the end as well, that you will find titled Politics of Economic Growth in India. Those two the two readings which talk about the period of the 1980s, and then the 1990s. So a lot of the change you see in India which is in terms of its sort of structural reform happens in the 90s. But the pathway to those reforms in the 90s was laid by a few years of modernization in economic policy and shift seen or experienced in the Indian economic limelight under Rajiv Gandhi. And then years after that, you see the Indian economy shifting and the political class getting more consensus to undertake liberalization reforms, which were essential to opening up the Indian economy for more trade, investment, and capital mobility. And so the 90s and the 80s become these critical decades where a lot of churn happens. So Kohli's reading, it's a two-part reading, discusses the scenario of Indian states, because beyond the national presence of any form of leadership, the states have their own economic policy space. They have their own governments, which are fairly more independent in terms of agency and determining their own economic and fiscal policy. So you get a very good perspective of which states do well in the 80s and then sort of lose out as a result of the liberalization reforms nationally taking place in the early 90s. And that's important to see and understand from the perspective of both, looking at the sort of the national picture, but also the statewide picture as well. So the period of time between 1980 and 88 see the sort of transition from a more protectionist, close-ended, nationalist, left of the um, political and economic agenda sort of economic policy to a more pro-business, relatively more open, modernized, technologically more open to investment economy under Rajiv Gandhi. Um, there is then a shift and a structural shift from 1991 onwards, which is called as the post-liberalization years, or the Indian adaptation of the Washington Consensus sort of liberalization, privatization, globalization agenda. It was done in response to a balance of payment crisis that India was experiencing. For those who may not know what a balance of payment crisis is, India's foreign currency reserves had dwindled to a very marginal sum where it could perhaps have paid only for imports for a couple of weeks, and that had made its situation extremely dire. It had approached the World Bank for a loan, and informed the IMF accordingly, and the World Bank offered a loan giving a recommendation for a certain string of national economic policy changes that India would have to adopt, which it did, with some minor changes that it wanted to undertake on its own. But the nature of those changes for the Indian economy brought a huge and enormous transformative shift from an agriculturally driven economic growth model to what would become eventually a service sector led competitive economic growth model, where some of its sectors like automobile, pharmaceuticals, um, information technology, financial services, some of these sectors would become eventually, over a period of time, globally competitive uh, through a greater openness of trade and investment, which was made possible as a result of these 91 reforms. Now, there is a significant number of challenges that the Indian economy faces. I will try to sort of address these in two parts, which is to talk about the challenges that exist now and uh, sort of explain that in reference to a lot of those challenges emerging from the nature of policy choices that the Indian economy made in the 1990s. For a lot of people or development economists and scholars working on the Indian economy, the argument is that the track one liberal pro-market reforms that were undertaken of the 1990s were supposed to be followed by a track two a spectrum of reforms which would liberalize and make things much more easier on, let's say, factor markets, reforms of land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, technology, and those things didn't happen as expected, and that made the divergence of growth more stark, inequality generally to broaden, a sort of a disjointed presence of the labor market, which became extremely more aligned to the rise of informality. Despite all the sort of positive reinforcement of a pro-market neoliberal supply side economic agenda. Because if you see the Indian economy, the state of the economy prior to the 1990, you realize how poorly it was performing across most of its indicators then. So the growth trajectory between, let's say, the 1950 to 2000, if you just sort of were to sort of put it up on a chart, you'll see that the volatility in growth, that is the spikes up and down in extreme terms, is higher. You see a huge departure from the growth trend, which is hardly stable across the years. One of the reasons was that India's growth base was linked a lot to the performance of its agricultural sector, because most people were working in agriculture. Most of the revenue income was coming also from the agricultural sector. The manufacturing and the industrial sector was not well developed. And so the volatility in growth was seen as a result of changing monsoons and water access from monsoons for the performance of agricultural sectors. In years when you had good rainfall, you'll see agricultural sector doing well. And then as a result, the expected sort of yield on crops and the sale of those was better. And many years that was not the case. And as a result, the growth rate was particularly more volatile. The emergency years, as you see, 1975, 1976, 77, 78, that period, growth plummets down. There is, in fact, negative growth of over -4%. The economy sort of crashes for those that 1 2 years right around and after the emergency, which is the political crisis leaded to a larger economic crisis. But if you see the mid 1980s onwards, the years where the Indian economy sort of stabilizes in relative performance, these are the years. These are the years when Rajiv Gandhi is in power. You have a situation where, over a period of time, um, the liberalization reforms of 1991, 92 is opening up the economy to um, greater or higher growth possibilities. And a lot of this is happening as a result of the kind of shifts that the Indian economy makes. But you see that the growth picture positively becomes more aligned to a 7-8% growth trajectory in the post 1990s period. There was a crisis, of course, between 89 91. This is the balance of payment crisis I was telling about, which then makes the industrial policy and the political status quo to drastically shift away from its prior economic agenda. And the trend holds for making the growth more stable at a higher level, which is when sort of India enters the world market and plays an important role. There are distinctive phases of economic growth. I had mentioned about the Nehru phase, which is phase one, the average rate of growth being around 4.1%. Soviet era style sort of planning, Fabian socialism, state anchoring, and doing much more of sort of public investment, investment in heavy infrastructure, steel, iron, all of those basic foundations. I mean, this is sort of an approach that slightly was borrowed and taken around that time from the conventional wisdom of FDR in the US, the Soviet sort of planning model seen in Soviet Union. where conventionally it was felt, and especially after the Second World War, that the state had to do a lot more in providing heavy infrastructure and controlling some of the more national industries for investment purposes. In some cases, to drive in private capital, but also to substitute and correct for the issues where private capital may be more volatile. 65 to 81 is where things really struggle. And this is where you have the average rate of growth actually dropping to around 3.2%. There are many years between this period of time when Indira Gandhi is in power, for the majority of this period, where growth is touching barely around 2%. It's this period of time which sees nationalization of Indian banks. It sees experiments on the level of sterilization, population control being made. I mentioned about the constitutional emergency that was invoked. So a lot of those things did not enable a higher growth trajectory for the economy at large. And that's in many cases what contributed to what is now often said and defined as the lost decade of the Indian economy. It is the exact same period, as I was saying, where countries like South Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, I mean, we can see in context to the East Asian economies, but also to some of the countries where growth potential was not very high, them entering the larger economic integration scene and benefiting from greater openness to trade and investment. India, on the other hand, sort of suffered the plight of a very severe left of the political agenda, restricted economic policy. 81 to 88, you see growth picking up. This is the sort of slight push towards modernization by Rajiv Gandhi, things becoming a little bit more open, lesser regulations, but still nothing too drastic or change. But it sees for the first time an effort in the post-independent economy to generate growth out of greater capital mobility and investment. This is perhaps the only decade, which is the decade of 1980s, particularly post 1984, when Rajiv Gandhi comes in power, where industrial performance or manufacturing performance in India does well compared to all other sectors. And you'll see the numbers shortly in explaining that. Phase four beginning in 1988-89, but primarily from the reform years of 91, go on to shape what would be the fastest and highest growth trajectory in the Indian economy. The Indian economy still grows at around 6%, but the kind of jump that it had seen between, let's say, perhaps 2002 and 2012. I mean, the rising, shining period of the Indian economic growth trajectory is the decade of 2002 to 2012, which is when the growth was averaging around north of 8%, 8 to 9%. Much of its development and performance indicators were doing very well. There was a gradual shift away from uh, sort of larger inequality in access to resources to greater upward mobility of India's low and middle income groups. But that decade beyond 2012 started then seeing a churn and a turn downwards, which is representative of the nature of challenges it faces now. Um, the pre and the post reform years, as you would see, help you to explain two things. One, there's lesser volatility in growth post 91. The growth also picks up, it's more stable. While in pre-91 period, there's less stability, there's more volatility in growth, which is often not ideal for business and political certainty. Now, these are some reference readings. I had mentioned to you that there are two very interesting sort of commentaries, not very extensively detailed chapters, but journal articles that are accessible, but at the same time very useful to understand the period of time between 1918 and 2005. In fact, what I'd request you to do is perhaps look at this these two readings before you come in for the Tuesday session, where we can discuss in more extensive detail on the nature of economic challenges that in the Indian economy faces. What I would also want you to do is to be able to get a perspective on the Nehru years, and for the Nehru years or for the immediate post-independent economic scenario, there's a reading by Arvind Panagria, which is called India, the Emerging Giant. It's a book which is there in your scan book references in the readings folder. And there is a chapter which it has in the introduction or table of contents, which talks about the years of 1947 to 64, and then the Indira Gandhi years of 1964 to 1980. So much of the discussion we are having right now on those two critical terms are explained in an extremely lucid detail, and at the same time very accessible, descriptive space, which gives you a perspective on how those years were for the Indian economy. But the nature of the economic outcome was a product of who was in power, what was his or her uh, ideological disposition, at the same time, how that disposition changes. Nehru saw himself to advocate for greater modernization and acceptance of liberal values. But in economic policy terms, he advocated for a socialist state anchored, more state driven planning system, which worked to a certain degree well for the Indian economy initially, right after independence. But if you were to say that post 1964, the objective would have been to take that forward and then open up the economy to get more integrated with the rest of the world. And that did not happen. In fact, it went under more severe economic tension and pressure under Indira Gandhi. So the explanation of those details are very well elucidated in that in those two chapters. Post 1980 perspective, as what Atul Kohli talks about in the politics of economic growth, gives you a very good scenario or mapping of two particular outcomes. One is on how states in India do or perform during these decades, and how the larger national reform change or the change in the national reform agenda affects Indian states and the overall economic growth performance. So it would be useful if you can look at these references before you come in for the Tuesday class, or at least have a glance reading of it. Our a session on for certain aspects of what can be explained right now, but then explained in more detail in when we look at our class on Tuesday, would focus on is this primarily a critical question, which is on the nature of macroeconomic challenges that the Indian economy faces. They're more transient in nature, given the fact that the challenges are not products of just all structural change challenges or changes. And there's some which due to degree of policy interventions have been able to see a more positive performance update. And in some cases, there is a more worsening of effect from what was before. And you can divide these challenges to roughly around six overheads. I feel the first two are particularly critical in highlighting, or the first three, for example, and highlighting those in this particular lecture and taking then much of the conversation forward on the remaining three in the next class. Um, the first is the concern around sectoral performance gap. India's economy was primarily or has been primarily agricultural in nature. Much of its economic landscape is dependent on how well its rural economy does. Three-fourths of its people always stayed in villages, and most of those people working in villages were based out in the agricultural sector. Even now, as we speak, 45 to 46% of India's workforce is still more or less entirely dependent on agricultural work as its primarily means of livelihood. And as a result, its transition to moving away from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services, that natural sectoral transformation never really happened. And that's a big concern in context to the way the nature of inequality that exists helps us to understand how this and why this has happened. Because in any industrially developed country, you see that up until 19th century and then 20th century, there were periods of time across decades that in some cases initially generationally, and then even within generations, people saw themselves moving out of agriculture to manufacturing, industrial work, and then with more education, more qualifications, and the expansion of cities moving into high-end or better value or more high value added services. The Indian scenario is the sort of story of a disjointed focus of services versus agriculture, where you have rural areas still dependent with much of its population on agriculture, and at the same time, an extensively high presence of an urban elite, which is invested in performative outcomes of value added services from financial technology, information technology, services, financial services, and also a mixed bag of middle and low value added services. But much of its growth story is being explained by the service sector led growth of urban cities. Manufacturing, on the other hand, in the last 2 to 3 decades, in value added terms, has not seen any significant growth. And that's been one of the key issues with India's growth story. There's a huge debt problem that banks face at the same time, because much of the banks were nationalized in the 1960s under Indira Gandhi. The effect of the nationalization of banks was less experienced at that time, because much of India's banking capital was not well organized then. But if you were to look at now in terms of the aggregated amount of debt that a lot of, or the non-performing assets that a lot of banks accumulate or have, you would realize that uh, the degree or presence of high banking debt or non-performing assets, as what it is called, is a result of banks not having adequate amount of risk cover to the kind of loans that it lent out. A lot of these loans were lent out not just to sort of support rural areas, but also to corporate entities and industrial classes, which were not really or well checked. There is another sort of major issue of credit growth and issues around credit growth that you'd find experiencing or having um, in a sort of a cyclical churn. Now, for those not well aware, I mean, credit is the fundamental aspect of what shapes any economy. I mean, if there is easier availability of credit, you can expect more and more businesses to take more loans and be able to invest in capital and generate more growth over a period of time. But if you have lesser growth of credit or lesser availability of credit, it's difficult to get a loan. It's difficult to buy a house. It's difficult to buy land or set up a company. It is going to make things difficult for um, firms and households as well. So when there's higher debt on your balance sheet, you'll be less capable in lending more money out. And that's what a lot of the Indian public banks have faced. So a lot of the lending and borrowing happening right now is mostly through the private banking sphere. And most of the private banking sphere right now is accessible amongst a very narrow group of uh, consumers in urban areas. So the twin balance sheet problem, as it is often called, and we can just look the term up for those who may not be aware, entertains scenarios where you have a crisis on your liability side for a bank, and also on your asset side. For a bank, the asset is the loan it lends out to other people because it gets interest on those loans. and it generates its own capital by lending more money out. The liability what the banks have is in terms of deposits. The greater the number of deposits, the better it is. But if we have more withdrawals of deposits or lesser deposit strength, banks would be less capable then in that case to lend out money. Of course, this is the basic 101 sort of summative explanation of what and how banking works. But in the Indian scenario, the last 2 decades in particular have exposed structural crises in India's banking sector, the public sector banking in particular, which is the dominant one by both market share and ownership. You have then private banking, which is now more or less is sort of driving much of the banking capital or financial capital growth in the country. On macroeconomic challenges, there is a significant amount of data that you would find which helps you explain and understand the nature of challenges on the macroeconomic front. Connected to these are issues of gendered segregation as well. So I'll show you a few sort of data points that will help explain the first two or three problems that we have put out here. So in terms of distribution of workforce, the last census, which is the national data collection exercise taken at a household level, which gives you a perspective on how Indian households are doing, what in terms of their consumption patterns, livelihood, occupation, everything, the largest sort of data exercise that happens once in a decade. So the census is now underway after after 2011. It was supposed to be done 2021, but was delayed inevitably by almost 3 to 4 years, and which makes the access of unit level or household data extremely sparse. And you have to then rely on a number of proxy indicators to measure or performatively assess how growth is doing at on across sector and different areas. So if you look at the sectoral composition of growth, agriculture, of course, dominates for much of the time. It still is roughly around 49-50%. 21.5% is the essential part of industry in workforce for the economy at large. You have services, which is vital in shaping the uh, larger growth picture now. This wasn't the case, of course, in the pre-1990s picture, but much of the main growth being generated in India is emerging from the service sector. Agricultural sector is no longer contributing as much as it is used to, but is still the main dominant sector. But what you want to really see, the critical sort of picture in this image is how industry is not grown at the level one would envisage an emerging country, especially with a labor intensive uh, economy, to do well. And I mean, one of the things you will find a star comparison on this with a completely different outcome, it would be that of China. I mean, China's entire story is on industrial growth, which it builds on from the 1980s, first domestically and then internationally. And it's that industrial growth which allows China to sort of enter into a more stable state society contract or compact, where people's are safeguarded jobs in the industrial sector as they're moving out of agriculture. So you see the kind of upward mobility in the structural transformation of sectors and workforce uh, happening very naturally in the Chinese context. Uh, Not so in the Indian scenario, given the industrial sector doesn't really grow at its level. There's a term often used in political economy, which is of what Danny Roderick calls as premature industrialization, where some emerging developing countries did not fully industrialize, sort of grew at a certain level and then moved across to another sector for growth. And I mean, India fits into that example where it saw a lot of premature deindustrialization. And the deindustrialization, meaning that its shift away from industry to services, happened at a level where its industrial growth capacity was not fully utilized. And that's pretty evident here as well. The 1980s, as I was saying earlier, is perhaps the only period where industrial growth was nearing or averaging over 6%. You don't see that in comparison to any other decade in post-independent India. I mean, one of the reasons, and I've been trying to sort of do some work with a group of researchers and trying to estimate is why was this the case, is because the nature of relaxations in business restrictions, the licenses and permits that were required in industries were drastically reduced under Rajiv Gandhi between the period of 1984 and 88, which allowed a significant change in industrial and manufacturing performance in those years. And this is also the period where India's sort of labor intensive manufacturing performance is doing well. So workers are more or less finding greater agency and presence in those sectors. And the scenario shifts completely post 91. Services come into the scene, and that's where a lot of the growth picture shifts. So as much as services are important, I mean, the whole point of the story here is that services are critical. They're mostly vital in adding value to not just growth, but employment and the overall economic potential. But many services, especially high value added services, can be done by a very narrow group of extremely skilled human capital endowed workers, English speaking, well educated, at the same time being able to compete with the globally competitive workforce. And that's hardly, I mean, even less than sort of 4% of the overall educated workforce in the Indian scenario. And as a result, you have then higher inequality, spatially and also in terms of sectoral inequality across sectors, from services to the other areas. Agricultural, forestry, fisheries, all of these are demarcating or sort of explaining of the larger presence or shift of the Indian land space. You have a position or you have a space where sectorally you have each of these spaces given a lot of impetus. Um, in terms of the union budget focus, the agricultural sector and the revenue generated from agricultural sector is not taxed in India. So there are a lot of fiscal incentives that were given and are given, but there are some major issues with how the agricultural sector has also performed. Um, Issues of land acquisition, issues with respect to farmers and the nature and the pattern of farming, and so the rural areas generally and the farming process overall has been ignored in the economic policy imagination at large. It's been seen as a sector which needs to be sort of more or less compromised, consolidated for political economy reasons, electoral strength amongst parties. But barring a period of time in the 1960s when India experienced the wheat revolution, when it experimented with high yielding varieties, HYV varieties of seeds uh, in many wheat growing parts of the country, farmers who could invest in that technology, who could buy those expensive seeds, saw a huge jump in crop production. And as a result, wheat production across the region at large and the belt was being experienced. Industry and manufacturing, as I've said, has sort of not grown to its full potential. Last few years, if you would see the data on this, which is from 1914, that's when Modi, current prime minister, comes in power. He was seen as someone who would also develop or build the agricultural sector. He had a campaign promise of doubling farmers' income, and a lot of those things were promised. But the actual growth and revenue in the agricultural sector did not grow at the same level. 2000, I mean, this is a sort of a pre-COVID or pre-pandemic period of performing data, which helps us explain what is happening. This particular chart, particularly the one on the the sort of bottom right you'll find is to be of great, I think, revelation in the sense of explaining what I'm saying. The divide between the rural-urban sphere, the the population or workforce being extremely reliant and dependent on the agricultural sector, while the urban population of the workforce or workforce reliant on the service sector. So there is a policy bias which is naturally inclined to promote more discussion, more emphasis on the service sector, while the agricultural sector doesn't get that much of importance, even though the majority of your rural workforce is based on that. Um, there's some technical things which I feel that it might be better to discuss those on Tuesday when we can also sort of take this conversation forward to talking about some of the other challenges. But in the last 10 years, particularly, I mean, India saw its best growth sort of period between 2002 and 2012, as I said, grew at over 8%. A lot of upward mobility, development indicators doing well. But a lot of things have been not going so well for the economy at large at a macroeconomic level from 2012-13 onwards. This is just a year or 2 years before the current party and the current prime minister came in power. There was clearly a certain degree of discontentment with the political status quo around that time, which is around 2012, 13, 14, people voting for change. But overall, in a nutshell, or if you see the indicators, the improvement has not been in any sense stark across the composition of growth in the last decade or so as well. So even from 2013 to 2023, 24, if you were to take data the last year, some of these issues still persist. I mean, there's slowing private investment demand, which is that lesser and lesser private sectors are investing in across sectors. I mean, of course, it's difficult to compare and take that as a point. I mean, in comparison to what, for example, a country like Canada or the US or Europe as a region is experiencing, India, of course, has greater impetus on private investment capital. But within the Indian scenario itself, what it needs, and in terms of the kind of challenges, developmental challenges it has, the degree of higher inequality or poverty it faces, the level of growth it needs to achieve doesn't have the optimal level of private investment being experienced or seen. There is weak export demand. I mean, India's never really exported extensively. It has a trade surplus with the United States because of the skilled people, doctors, uh, people working in nursing, medical sciences to academia, in generally, or the IT sector for that matter, which have all been sort of contributed from the Indian sphere. Beyond services, there's not much of really a great amount of potential in exports that India was able to harness or maximize. Unlike the East Asian counterparts, where export-oriented industrialization was critical in shaping India's their growth story. In the Indian scenario, the NX, which is the export demand, is not great. So what you see is Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Now, this is a growth identity equation for those who may not know, where output or income is seen as a product of total consumption expenditure. There is investment, there is government spending, and there is net exports. So some countries grow more on in terms of income because of rise in exports. Some country grow because their government spend a lot of money across productive sectors. Some countries grow because there's a lot of investment, foreign investment, domestic investment, which is in productive sectors. And some countries grow because there's a lot of consumption demand. So the US has one of the largest consumption demands in the whole world. It consumes more of everything across the board, and that high consumption demand pushes more and more investment and allows for a greater degree of connection in markets as well with other countries. So China can feed the US consumption demand, um, because it can maximize its production to scale, and then sort of sell those goods to the US because there is that demand. So if consumption demand weakens, if investment demand or investment levels weaken, growth performance lags. It's then dependent a lot on the government spending overall, which is how much the government is spending, and much of the growth will come from there. The Indian scenario right now is sort of reflective of that. There's huge pressure on G, which is government spending, to meet the gaps for investment and weakening consumption demand. A lot of the foreign direct investment, which was anticipated to grow over the years, has not grown at that level. There's a lot of capital flight in terms of many firms or investors pulling money out across different sectors. And see, some of this is because of external factors. You can't entirely blame the Indian economy or the internal sector much on that. But whether those factors are exogenous or internal to the process of growth, it's nevertheless impacted the growth story negatively. And it's a part of also a worldwide phenomena. Many countries are experiencing this, where foreign investment, capital mobility across markets is weakening because of uncertainty, because of issues of political strife, all of the above. But its inability to expand on exports, not being more export oriented in its industrial strategy, not keeping its consumption demand up, some of those issues are more endogenous or internal to the process of India's growth. So these are some macro facts on growth. Of course, I'll talk a little bit about these as I sort of explain some of these issues in the next class. The data points you see in front of you right now are explaining what we were discussing here, particularly on IEC, which is investment savings and the overall FDI levels, which have been weakening. Services is the sector which has been growing, but to a lot of people who don't know, each of these sector and services also dependent on how well other sectors do. Manufacturing, as you see, in the last 5 to 6 years, has not grown at that level. It's as a percentage of GDP, as in a percentage of overall income being generated, manufacturing is not driving that story. Now, this is a bit surprising because the government has put an enormous amount of money in the last 10 years in boosting its manufacturing sector. And they've had campaigns, they've had a lot of subsidized funding, a lot of performance linked incentive schemes. But the manufacturing success story in the Indian context has been still something which is yet to be realized, and its overall performance has not grown at that level as one would have anticipated. Domestic private investment demand is a function of credit growth, supply of loanable funds. I mean, this is a basic concept which explains that private investment demand is a function of how much of credit is growing, how much of banks are able to give loans to the private sector. So, as I was telling you, that there is a banking crisis where credit is not being easily made available, especially because of the kind of challenges the public sector banking faces. Sometimes that freezes credit for availability for firms. In the Indian context, the bigger firms don't face that problem because private banks take care of that, and private banks are in a much better position, and the bigger firms don't have those issues. But the micro, small, medium scale enterprises, which is what are called as MSMEs, which also have 80% of the industrial workforce present. I mean, 80% of India's industrial workforce is in MSME sector. So the micro, small, medium scale enterprises, they have been struggling for credit, and they've been incurring a lot of debt. Their production capacity has been weakened. And crises like the pandemic, crises like what India did in 2016 with demonetization, some of these crisis episodes or shocks really impacted the MSME sector, and it has failed itself to recuperate or recover fully. It's affected a lot of issues on jobs, and there's a whole discussion around employment, which will help you explain and understand how the degree of higher unemployment and underemployment of workers. So industrial uh, sector has not grown with an improved performance of MSMEs due to a number of these factors. So credit freeze is a big issue, and it's in some cases explained by the chart here, where credit growth, as in growth in credit access adjusted for inflation or outside food, is something which is not being seen at the level that one would have envisaged. The issues around debt with banks, particularly public sector banks, um, measured by the sort of non-performing asset ratio for, I mean, as an indicator, non-performing assets measure that loans that are given but not recovered, poorly performing loans, some of those things are measured by this, and that you would find has been a troubling problem. So a lot of that debt has been accumulated in public sector banks, which has found it difficult to lead or provide for credit. So I think at this juncture, what I'll do is I'll pause for a discussion on macroeconomic employment challenges, which are very much connected with what's happening on gender segregation of workforce. Let me start with some of these issues on Tuesday and then sort of take that to its final conclusion. You'll get a sort of a more nuanced perspective on the nature of challenges between workers, um, what issues workers face in terms of sectoral performance, and generally a sort of a key data point around unemployment and its rise amongst both rural and urban educated workers is something which is higher than ever before, and that's been a troubling point. The more people are getting educated, the more in the Indian labor market scenario, their chances of being unemployment and the probability of that goes up. And that, I think, is a big concern. You still have a huge population, as you see here, which is in the rural areas. The rural areas are conditionally dependent on agricultural work. There's very little opportunities outside agriculture, which makes a lot of the rural workforce to migrate to the cities for work. And the urban centers also have not been sort of generating the amount of growth that one would envisage for the excesses of the rural workforce participation scale to be absorbed. Um, so we'll discuss about these as a critical starting point for the session on Tuesday. What I would request you to do is perhaps utilize, as we were looking at, is perhaps two or three critical points. There is this discussion on 1947, 64, 64, 80, which you will find in Arvind Panagria's book, India, the Emerging Giant. It's there in your readings folder. It has a specific chapter on Nehru and Indira Gandhi, the years when they were in power across different phases of growth. The period of time where things start churning or transitioning out from the limitations of growth possibilities that were being seen is under the Rajiv Gandhi years, which is between 84 onwards and 88, and then the liberalization years. So to be able to make yourself more familiar with those trajectories, it might be helpful. So looking at the politics of economic growth, this reading for the 1980 and post 1980 picture would be helpful. And then on the two chapters from Arvind Panagria's India, the Emerging Giant, the textbook, which is there in your scan references, that will be helpful. I mean, this is for those who've had absolutely no idea of being able to know about the Indian economy at large. You don't need any prerequisite, complicated, I think, knowledge of economics as such to understand this. This is a more descriptive summary of how the Indian economy is done, which is a product of the nature of policy choices its leadership made. And the nature of those policy choices are responsible for the structural nature of some of the macroeconomic challenges. There's the issue with sectoral performance gap that I've mentioned about here is a case in point. The 1990s made the Indian government to focus a lot more on services, almost at the cost of manufacturing and agriculture, which is why the rural population and rural sectors don't do as well as what many of the urban centers do. And while services has contributed a lot to the growth, overall growth performance, the enabling or the modernization of agriculture, inclusion of greater impetus on manufacturing has not happened. Um, so that helps explain some of the issues that we have talked about. With that, I'll probably for today at least I'll pause for our conversation with our discussion on some of the issues on the macro facts on growth, consumption, investment, growth spending. Much of the India current growth is coming from the G of the government spending. Investment demand and capacity has been weak in the Indian context. There's evidence of consumption demand weakness as well. And exports have never really picked up in pace at any point of time. So some of these issues, as I've mentioned, are as critical. It may appear that they require a certain degree of orientation in macroeconomic concepts, but that's not necessarily the case. The idea is to just get a perspective on how or to what extent growth as an overall sort of process is affected by the nature of political economy, um, choices of independent nation states. So with that, maybe for today at least, we'll come to a close on this. I'll request you to go through the recording and the specific readings, and I'll take the conversation forward in the next class by talking more in length from the nature of challenges the Indian economy faces on its employment and labor market scene. Thank you.